Hey folks, Mike here, the Security Silverback. And in this session, I want to address one of those problems that people often either ignore or just forget about. Namely, old pieces of kit that have reached the end of life and aren't getting the security updates they need anymore. For example, the 60,000 odd old D-Link NAS devices that our EOL and D-Link have advised users to retire because they're not going to be releasing a fix. This isn't to throw shade at D-Link for standing by end of life actually meaning end of life. But before we go deeper, hit those subscribe and notify buttons and maybe give a like when you get to the end. Or even before you get to the end. Now though, it's time to dive into D-Link's reaction to a couple of recent vulnerabilities and why it's part of a much bigger challenge. The vulnerabilities in questions are CVE 2024-10914 and 2024-3273. 10.9.14 is rated as a severity 9.2 and could let an unauthenticated attacker execute arbitrary shell commands on the device using a specially crafted HTTP GET command, like this one. Fortunately, it's not an easy exploit to pull off, at least by NIST assessment. That makes it a lot less likely to see a rash of 10-year-old NAS boxing getting compromised. Which boxing, you ask? Good question. That'd be the D-Link DNS 320, 320LW, 325, and 340L. This is largely the same list of kit that was affected by CVE 2024-3273, both of which were written up by NetSecFish, and I've included a link to their GitHub repo that explains the vulnerabilities in depth. The real point here is D-Link's security bulletin on this EOL kit, which the link in the description, and their decision to say basically, it's end of life, we're not going to fix it, you should replace it. That is what end of life means, after all. Now, some vendors will release patches after EOL for devices or operating systems that are still in heavy use and have a serious vulnerability crop up. Why? I'd suggest the liability is probably more than their legal department wanting to deal with. But that's not always the case, especially for appliance class kit. After all, if it was only a couple $100 and is a decade old, why are you keeping it in service? At least that's how I'd be thinking of it. In fact, if you're a medium to large organization, none of this should really be a problem. You have the budget and the resources to replace EOL kit for production, and old kit like this either winds up getting recycled, sold off, or dropped into a lab somewhere isolated from the production network. But what if you're a small business or a home user? What do you do when, for whatever reason, you've got EOL'd piece of kit or an operating system or software or something and can't take it out of service? The first thing to do is something you should have done when you first installed it, whatever it is, regardless of how big an operation you are. Namely, set it up as securely as possible in the first place. Make sure only the people who need access have access, make sure it's configured as tightly as practical, and make sure it's isolated on the network as possible. These are all best practices you should be following anyway. Though, I admit, for something like a NAS, access restrictions and network isolation can be problematic if you want to use it for, easily storing things across the network. When you're dealing with an EOL situation, though, you need to up the game. Assuming you're in a situation where you can't replace it, which, to be honest, is what you should be doing, you're going to need to isolate it as much as possible and restrict access to the people who need it and no one else. That's what a friend of mine had to do with one of their commercial radio applications. It was EOL, but there wasn't a good option to replace it, so they isolated as much as they could and kept it in service a lot longer than they probably should have. Something you can do in some cases is keep the kit in service, but replace whatever OS it's running, assuming there's an alternative. With old computers, it's a piece of cake. If your kit's too old to install Windows 11 or Windows 2022 server, no worries. There's a Linux distro that'll have you covered. Or BSD if you want to try something different. For other kit though, your mileage may vary. Linksys access points, for example, are famous for having alternative firmware. With the D-Link systems that we've been talking about, there is an alternative firmware for at least the D-Link DNS 320 and 325 on SourceForge called Alt-F, in case you're wondering about it. I included a link in the description, but have no experience with it, so experiment at your own risk. D-Link states that running an alternative firmware voids the warranty, but it's a piece of 10-year-old end-of-life kit, so what do you got to lose? As I said earlier, if you're a medium or large organization, you have the resources to update your operating systems and hardware as needed to stay ahead of the game. If you're a small shop, you have to weigh the cost of replacing systems with the operational requirements of keeping the old systems safe, or installing alternative operating systems or firmware, or just eating the risk that comes with not doing anything. While I used to keep old kit in my lab to tinker with, the reality is that most of the time it's worth the expense of retiring that old equipment to reduce the risk and usually improve performance. And that's the bottom line. For production systems, the risk versus cost balance usually falls in favor of retiring kit before it reaches the end of life. So you're not left scrambling at the last minute trying to protect something you shouldn't have in production anymore anyway. Now, that's all for now. There's links in the description to the relevant alerts, CVEs, and the alternative firmware for the affected kit. Until next time, stay safe.